All right, hello everyone. My name is Dave Jangraw. I'm at the University of Vermont, and I'm delighted to be here to present our research, which we're calling HealthTRAC. This is our method for unobtrusive in-home assessment of both physical and cognitive health in rural seniors. And I want to thank the AITC for the invitation. We've recently received pilot funding from the CTVC as part of the AITC's seed funding. So this is a hugely collaborative effort that involves the people you see at the bottom here and more that didn't have space to list. And it's a bridge between work that's funded by the NSF EPSCoR program, SOX, and the Center on Aging and at the University of Vermont, which is where we take our in-lab work and bring it into the home. So I'm going to stop at a couple of points during the presentation and take questions. You can feel free to leave any questions in the Q&A section, and I'll try to get to those at those pause points, and you can also send your questions to me other ways outside of this talk by sending me an email at djangraw@uvm.edu. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what my lab does. We're going to talk about why we're studying conversation, which is a big piece of the work I'm going to highlight today. We're going to talk about quantifying normal conversations, assessing conversations in the home rather than in the laboratory. And then finally, some of the things we're doing next with the hopes that you may have some sort of experience with this, want to have a conversation about it, or want to talk about working together. The main issue that motivates my lab's work is that 1 in 5 adults in America experience a mental illness sometime in their lifetime, and we expect that number to be similar worldwide. And these are usually defined by reactions to real-life experiences. However, recognizing those real-life experiences and quantifying their reactions, something that laboratory science is not all that good at. So what we'd like to be able to do is recognize and address disordered brain states in real life where they're taking place, and react to them in real time, something like a pacemaker for the brain. The challenge is that the laboratory experiments tend to be simple and static and frankly quite boring, whereas our experiences are dynamic and immersive and engaging. And so what my lab tries to do is fill this gap between them by developing naturalistic experiments, quantifying the naturalistic brain states that we observe there, and then pushing further and further towards real-life experience. So the premise is that we can only build this pacemaker for the brain if we can break the study of the brain out of the lab. So today I'm going to be talking about one way that we are pushing towards the measurements and understanding of real-life experience, and that is using wearables to understand factors involved in aging. So this is an area of active research, especially as wearables are having a moment, and AI is helping us to make sense of the big data that we observe there. 2 studies that came out about a month apart in Nature journals both talk about using cardiovascular measures from a wearable device to measure some sort of estimate of your chronological age. And both studies found that in these large data sets, if your estimated age, your predicted age, is higher than your actual chronological age, then that difference is suggestive of some sort of cardiovascular risk factor that should perhaps be addressed by a clinician. So this idea that you might have an actual age here, a predicted age here, and that when they disagree, that disagreement is informative of some kind of risk, has gained traction in literature, but is limited to areas where there are large data sets that we can use to train deep learning models. And what we'd like to do is try to expand this promising area of research and bring it into a couple of different areas of of age-related health. One is vocal quality and speech. So there are some speech language pathologists who are starting to develop frameworks that we could use to assess things about cognitive health, linguistic usage, affective, your sort of affect, your motor activity, anatomical health, and using features that can be extracted from sound. There's some promise here where some studies have started to find relationships between frailty and some of these features that we can extract from the sound. But this is a little bit less explored in the semantic aspects of speech, and that's an area where we think we can add some value. So what we'd like to do is take some health tracking technologies and try to assess sort of multifactorial aging. So the idea that functional aging has to do not just with your cardiovascular risk, but with your physical and cognitive health. And that these features that you might be able to measure that could be informative of your aging process might come from gait, your mobility and balance, your speech production and semantics, and your activities of daily living. So what we'd like to be able to do is measure these sort of holistically using a suite of in-home sensors that we place unobtrusively in the home, and can monitor this with the participant not really having to do very much at all. The idea is that we might be able to monitor risk factors and let the patient or their caregivers know if there is a change in their status that could threaten their ability to live independently, or might suggest that a doctor's visit would be in their best interest. So studies of gait, mobility and balance, and ADL are relatively mature and suggest that there are relatively simple features that can be extracted to measure physical health and your ability to live independently. However, cognitive health is a little bit more immature, and measures of speech production and semantics are sort of just emerging in the literature. So that's what I consider the most challenging aspect of this that we want to measure unobtrusively. And it's the one I'm going to focus on today as sort of a case study. So in order to use speech production and semantics as a measure of cognitive aging, we need to know what is normal conversation. How predictive can a speech-derived risk factor be? And then we want to ask, if we can establish this predictive risk factor, will people tolerate a sensor system like this that measures it? Can that system collect useful data? And how can we collect the data we need while preserving a patient's privacy? So to address this first question, we want to try to establish conversational norms. And we did this as part of the SOX project, the Science of Online Corporate Knowledge and Stories, funded by the NSF, using a database called the StoryCorps Archive. And some of you may be familiar with the podcast that StoryCorps produces. But this is a huge database of human voices where people are telling their life story to a friend or loved one. And StoryCorps has done a great job of collecting these stories from all across the country, from every state. And they've also created several initiatives that are designed to measure the stories of underrepresented groups. And one that's particularly interesting to us is an initiative that's designed to measure the stories of people suffering from memory loss disorders. So one of our tests of validity in this cohort is going to be whether the features we extract are predictive of whether someone belongs to this memory loss initiative. So to establish these conversation norms, we developed this pipeline where we downloaded over 70,000 stories, totaling more than 300 million words from the StoryCorps archive. We used open source tools to transcribe and diarize those audio files. This is a system called WhisperX that uses OpenAI's Whisper model for automated speech recognition, and the Piano package to diarize, that is, tell you which of two people were speaking at any given moment. We then extracted features of conversation that we believe are predictive of memory loss disorder or aging, but that are not related to what the person is talking about, but rather how they are speaking, the structure of that conversation, not the content. We next check on those features across the age range to develop this sort of normative curve. You think of it something like a growth chart that you would get for a child, where we can look at these cohesion related features as a function of age. And finally, we can compare groups, that is the control group and the memory loss initiative. So to begin with, we tested our transcription and diarization methods, which have actually gotten quite good in recent years. So we had our team of undergraduates randomly transcribe and manually transcribe and diarize a random 2-minute excerpts from many different audio files. And we found that the accuracy approaches the level of agreement between human raters, which is consistent with what people have found in the literature. I would say diarization is a little less accurate, and is an area of growth. But for now, we were satisfied with the diarization results and their ability to inform our features. So we started with an exploration of how control stories and memory loss initiative stories were different, and this was serving largely to help us focus our efforts on extracting, certain features of, that might be predictive of memory loss disorders. So to do this, we used a tool developed at UVM called the allotaxonometer, and essentially what you're seeing on the left is a two-dimensional histogram of the rank of various words. So the most common word will show up at the top of our 2D histogram, if it is the most common word in both the control stories and the memory loss stories. And so if you see, as you go from top to bottom, the words get less common in both stories. And as you move to the left, you're finding words that are relatively more common in the control group. And as you move to the right, you're seeing words that are relatively more common in the memory loss group. And so there's a certain extent to which this is expected just by chance. Uncommon words might have a larger variance in their rank between the two groups. And so we use a tuning parameter to sort of focus our attention on things that are just outside the norm. And then we can measure the ones that are farthest outside that norm and plot them in this ranked order. So having done this, we focused our attention on these words that you see here, and we noticed a few different groups of words that seem to be driving this difference. So the control group tended to use more evaluative adverbs and had greater markers of referential cohesion. That is, how much does what you're saying now refer back to something that has been said previously? So this is related to the idea that you're keeping the thread of the conversation between terms. Words like the, and it's, and that, and this require you to understand, hold in your memory what has happened before, and as sort of ascribe it to one of these general words. The control group also used more prepositions, which suggests more complex language, and tended to use more present tense and metacognitive language, which suggested not that they were not just telling a story, but they were evaluating the content of that story. The memory loss group, on the other hand, tended to use more pronouns, you, he, she, and your. tended to use more past tense verbs and question words, which suggested the recounting of stories rather than the evaluation of those stories. And finally, there were more minimal continuers and discourse markers like yeah, mm-hmm, uh-huh, huh, and yes, and well. So these suggested that either the patient or their conversation partner were just giving a little bit of a nudge to the other person to keep going. Now, we chose to focus our attention on this referential cohesion category because we found a sort of direct theoretical link to the changes in memory that might be driving these features. And it was something that our colleagues in speech language pathology felt matched well with their clinical experience. So again, we found that memory loss stories tended to use more pronouns, which suggested difficulty with lexical access to proper nouns, more past tense and question verbs, which suggested story recounting, more minimal continuers and discourse markers, which suggests story structuring by conversation partners. And control stories tended to use more evaluative language, suggesting narrative depth, and more referential ties and preposition, suggesting that there is sort of this embedded structure to the conversation that allows these concepts to become more complex. So we were interested to focus in on these changes to get, and importantly notice that they were reflecting how we talk, not just what we talk about. So having focused our attention on these features, we used an established tool called TACO, that is the tool for the automated analysis of cohesion, to extract various features that were sort of established categories of cohesion, not just the words that we had noticed in this exploratory study. And then once we extracted each of those features, we could build this normative curve that we were interested in creating. So that is, you'll be seeing a couple of plots on the next slide, where the horizontal axis is the person's actual age in years, and the y-axis is the feature of interest. And we have separate groups for the control stories and the memory loss stories. So you might see dots for each group, and then we'll plot a best fit line to the control stories with a standard error range around it, and do the same for memory loss stories. We expect this to have a wider standard error because it's a much smaller group. What we can then do is remove the effective age found in the control fit and just plot the distance from that line. That is, how far are we away from that line in the vertical direction? How far is each story from that control fit? And what we might expect to find is that the memory loss disorder group might have systematically higher or lower residuals from that control fit than the control group does. And this allows this set of histograms allows us to see just how far separated are they, and how well could this one feature be used as a marker of aging or of memory loss disorders. So as we focus on cohesion and macrostructure, one feature that we focused on was adjacent turn semantic overlap. And this is the idea that what you're saying on your turn overlaps semantically with what the other person was saying on their previous turn n-1, let's say. And so this is just how many words did you use that were also used by your conversation partner previously. And what we find is that as people age, we see this systematic decrease in the amount that you do that. And we're not judging this as being better or worse conversationally. We're just noticing that older people tend to have less adjacent turn semantic overlap. And what we find is that the memory loss group sort of mirrors this trend where older folks have less adjacent turn semantic overlap, but that the whole thing is shifted downwards so that everyone in the memory loss group on average has a lower semantic overlap. And so when we subtract this green control fit, we find that there's a noticeable difference between the control and memory loss groups. And at this scale we're working at, there's no surprise that this is highly significant. We're also interested in sort of macrostructural differences in the semantic content, where we're looking at dialogue acts. And this is a relatively well-studied area of research where folks have categorized the purpose of your current turn in the conversation. So things like greetings, statements, yes or no questions, action directives, signaling understanding, back channels, rejections, apologies, hedges. These can each be sort of categorized. And recently there have been developed deep learning systems that can categorize these dialogue acts automatically. So what we've done here is in a small group, we've used our automatic dialogue act tagger to count how often does each memory loss initiative story use each of these dialogue acts, and how often does each control story use these dialogue acts. And we find significant differences in the usage of almost every dialogue act, which is perhaps not surprising given the scale of our data set. But in some cases, the difference is quite striking just visually. For example, memory loss initiatives use a lot more yes or no questions, and control groups use a lot more statement of opinions. So we might use these dialogue acts to count up not just how often a person uses a dialogue act, but perhaps the structure of that dialogue act when it occurs. So one example is the length of a statement we find is relatively stable across ages, but in the memory loss group, we find that folks tend to have much shorter statements when they utter a statement, and that this feature can be used to separate the control and memory loss groups even better than the cohesion feature you saw on the previous slide. So we're just getting started with these sort of macro structural features, and we're putting a lot of effort into manually labeling these. On that front of manually labeling, we're also manually labeling etiologies. That is, what is causing the memory loss initiative classification? What is causing the memory loss? And the two most common etiologies we saw were Alzheimer's-related dementia and traumatic brain injury. So we developed a set of terms. There's nothing in the metadata that tells us what kind of memory loss disorder this person has. And so what we did was we sort of came up with a list of potential ways that they might have chosen to disclose this or talk about it in the course of the conversation. Did they happen to mention it? And so we searched all the transcripts for these words, and then we had a team of undergraduate annotators come in and look at the context around those mentions to make sure when they said the words Alzheimer's, were they confirming that they had received an Alzheimer's diagnosis, or were they talking about their grandmother who had Alzheimer's and they remember that experience? So these annotators helped us to determine the etiology for a group, sort of subset of the conversations where it was mentioned. And that allowed us to take our, set of plots and histograms that we showed previously and extend them out into a much larger group and to separate out Alzheimer's and TBI groups. So what you're seeing here is a more recent if less visually finished version of this plot, where we have a much larger control group of 40,000 stories. And if you look carefully, you can still see this, this line, this fit line showing up. And then we pull out about 100 Alzheimer's-related dementia stories and about 35 traumatic brain injury stories, and we plot the best fit lines to those as well. And so We can look at statement length separately in an Alzheimer's cohort and a TBI cohort and get a sense of whether the effect on each of these features might be different in an Alzheimer's cohort or a TBI cohort. So this kind of differential diagnosis is important here because Alzheimer's and TBI might have quite different effects on language and do based on past literature and our collaborators' clinical experience. So all this is to say, we're getting much better at pulling out these features and understanding how conversation structure helps us to distinguish between ages and between memory loss disorders. And using all of the different features that we've pulled out, we can train a machine learning classifier to get a single predictor value that might let us know whether someone is part of a machine learning group. So this is slightly different from the approach that I highlighted at the beginning of the talk, where we're trying to predict chronological age and then presuming that the difference between predicted age and true age is indicative of memory loss disorder. What we're doing instead here is including chronological age as a feature, and then building up a predictor to let us know whether a person belongs to the memory loss group. And so using just eight features that our collaborators suggested matched best with their clinical experience, we built a random forest classifier that could tell with somewhere around 80% accuracy whether a person belongs to the memory loss group or not. And we expect that this will only improve as we add additional features. So this is an active area of research for us that doesn't yet include the Dialogue Act tagging information that I just highlighted. We expect to be able to get pretty good classification using speech structure alone. And so this classifier is what will go into our processor, what will sort of build into our in-home classification of, or our in-home assessment of speech-related risk factors in our HealthTRAC system. So all of this that I've been talking about so far is sort of the work that has to go into having confidence in the features and having confidence in our ability to derive a risk factor from the speech we can collect in the home. It's still unknown whether the incidental speech that you might collect in the home as people are just talking to their friends and loved ones, whether that's actually going to use this, have the same relationship to memory loss disorders that you might see in this StoryCorps archive structure. But one of the things we're interested in doing is testing that hypothesis and seeing whether we can reliably distinguish between people with memory loss disorders and people without them in the home. So this is the point where I'm going to transition to talking about that in-home assessment. So now I think would be a good time to take questions if there are any, and just pause for a drink of water and a check-in with the group. So seeing none, no questions in the Q&A, I'm going to keep on going, but please feel free to jump in if you have questions that I missed. So as we're thinking about how to assess things like speech-related cognitive risk factors in the home, we want to see, given that we have some confidence of our ability to pull important information out of these sensors, will people tolerate these sensors in their homes? It's sort of a big ask to check whether we can measure these in the home. Well, it's sort of a big ask to ask people to put these sensors in their homes and allow us to listen in to a certain extent or look at their activity measures. So how do people feel about this, and how can we maybe put them more at ease through simple design choices? So to start with, we started with a questionnaire um, where we allowed people to indicate that they were in the right age group and they were living at home, and they were interested in this project. We allowed them to answer a questionnaire of about 50 questions about their experience aging at home, and their willingness to interact with some of these sensors. So I'm pulling out just a few of the answers from our participants, and I'm plotting them on this sort of stacked bar chart. So neutral or positive responses are on the right in positive in blue, and negative responses are on the left. So these are strongly disagree and disagree are in red and orange. And it's a little small, the exact wording of the questions, so I'm just going to highlight what they mean here. The responses to this first question suggest that users would act on HealthTRAC results if they had access to them. They would schedule an appointment with their healthcare provider if they got some measure of risk. Users generally feel comfortable using tech, which gives us some confidence in their ability to interact with this technology when necessary. Users are reticent about audio recording. They're cautious about this, and about half of people said they were not wild about having audio recording in their living rooms. But then a later question suggested that design choices might help with this. We got overwhelming agreement to comfort about recording if the person got to choose when they turn the device on. So we're hopeful that design choices might allow us to sort of push back on the caution about audio recording. And finally, people suggested that they would devote effort to HealthTRAC if asked, if that helped the system work better. So we don't have to just rely on things that are measured passively without any effort for them. We might be able to ask them to do a few things in the morning to help the system get the information it needs. All right, I see a couple of questions in the Q&A now. So maybe I'll take a minute and address some of these. So one person asked, how do you separate out caregiver speech? This is a challenge because the diarization systems out there are not foolproof. They are not super accurate. But the way that many of them work is based on the frequency content of the voice. You can think of this as sort of a vocal biomarker. And they'll attempt to get this sort of numeric embedding for the your vocal quality. And you can get that embedding sort of on a word-by-word basis. And then you can cluster them so that words that sound alike in their vocal quality are assigned to the same speaker. But these systems often require you to make some assumptions about how many people are in the room, and they often fail when there's overlapping speech or artifacts in the room. So we're going to try to use additional information to improve on that state of the art, which include having a sort of microphone array that might allow you to get some sort of directional measurement of where the person is. And we're going to see if we can use sort of heuristics and post-processing steps to address those like outlier cases where you have overlapping speech or something that might be mistaken for a voice but is actually not. Let's see. Someone asked, how do you make sure that it is with patient permission? This is something that I'm going to address a little bit later in the talk, so I'll return to that. And it's definitely something we've thought a lot about. And someone asked, Thomas asked, can your methods show progression of memory loss over time? In other words, track the development of memory of a family member? That's a great question, and we don't know, and we're excited to learn. We have some measure of, cross-sectional accuracy of, people with memory loss disorders sounding different from those without, but we don't have any longitudinal data at this point. And our pilot study, will not really allow us to do that. We're going to start with just a 6-day recording in the home, and then a check-in 6 months later. But the hope is that the pilot data from this study will allow us to collect that longitudinal data set and actually check for changes over time. Let's see. An anonymous person said, it's very impressive work. Thank you very much. And I love that that's an anonymous comment. You didn't want to be associated with the praise. Adam commented, I've seen multimodal measures of MCI that have achieved over 90% accuracy. I think adding vocal markers together with either psycholinguistic ones will make a significant difference. And yes, I do expect that that will gain a lot of accuracy. And that's from vocal markers. That's an area of that the field is getting much better at, and we're hoping to take advantage of that. As I asked, will the recording be shared? And I would say yes and no. We're building into our IRB protocol that sort of the features extracted from the data will be shared, but the speech itself will not. We want to be really careful that we're not invading privacy, that we're not sending out sensitive information about your daily life. And so we tried to restrict the sensitivity of the features that we'll share. We do hope to share sort of features that are a few steps from the raw data. Someone asked, have you studied pregnant women or those postpartum to understand the role of hormones while recovering? No, that's not an area that we've looked at. We've sort of focused on an older age group here. And in our StoryCorps data set, where we might have had pregnant women included in the sample, we didn't have information about pregnancy there. But it would be a really interesting area. Thomas asked, does your data take into account the subject's use of medicine, as many old people use as a variable? No, we do not currently collect that, but I'd be really interested to talk with you about suggestions about what medicines we should ask about and how we should factor that into our classification. And another anonymous attendee said, are you capturing non-human voices, interactions with companion animals and cognition? Yeah, that's a great question. We are not currently planning to try to detect non-human voices. We will measure when the participant is speaking, but there's no one speaking back. And I expect that could be sort of a phone conversation with someone we can't hear, or just talking to themselves. That sort of semi-monologue or conversation where maybe the other person can't be heard or doesn't exist, could be an interesting thing to sort of study in isolation. I don't think there's a whole lot out there in the literature about that category. And then finally, does your system correlate voice, volume or tone, and medication schedule changes in voice just after taking pills? Another great question related to the use of medication question. And yeah, I'd be interested in talking with you as well. About how we should factor that in. Sort of, it sounds like you're getting at not just what medications are being taken, but how long is it since the medication was taken. And Gerald asked, is there variability in speech production with time of day or emotional physical state? Yes, and yes, I believe. Time of day, I'm not aware of the research around that, but just stands to reason that your voice is croakier in the morning and might be tired at night. And so I definitely expect that to be a variable that we're going to have to account for or control for when we extract our variables. One way we're doing that is our scripted activities will try to be at the same time of day to sort of control for that. And emotional state is something that we might try and extract as it's a variable that some people have focused on in their research. And we might sort of include that as a variable of interest in our classifier, or something that could be sort of an interaction term, but we don't have a current plan to do that. Thank you to the anonymous attendee who would love to share and discuss more. That's great. I'll be happy to follow up with you. Okay, I think I finally made it to the ends of the questions. So I will keep on going here and return to the Q&A at the end. One other thing I wanted to share about our survey results, and this is my other big takeaway from the quantitative results, is that there's an opportunity for education here. You know, this is an emerging area of research. There's not a ton in pop culture about, wearable measures of speech and gait, and so. Some people were concerned that their family might not accept these sensors, but they're not really familiar with the types of data the wearable devices collect and how that data is stored and transmitted. Um, they might not be sure whether healthcare providers should see their data or whether other people should see it, and they might have some concern about who has access to that data. And so I think that some of this suggests that some of these the initial agreement or disagreement with these statements might actually move in response to education about how systems like this work and what the potential benefits could be. So it's something we're mindful of as we're trying to collect usability data, and this might be the first or maybe the only time that people interact with a system like this. So we're trying to proceed carefully. As we design this system with these things in mind, we're taking advantage of the feedback that we got from this survey and from a couple of in-person sessions with potential users. And what we're trying to do is combine off-the-shelf sensors, which we've identified from various past studies or online resources. We sort of developed, decided what to put in the home. And then we've developed custom interfaces with the home environment. So, starting with sort of prototypes that look like this and working our way towards, devices that look more like these renderings. As you can see, these are relatively unobtrusive. We don't want them to like scream at you and that you're being watched and that you're taking part in this study. We don't exactly want to hide it either or keep it a secret. One bit of feedback that we got from in person is we had this big old podcast microphone that we were going to put in their home because we didn't want people to be surprised that they were being recorded. But the person said, "Oh, no, I don't want that in my home. I want you to like make it look like a flower pot or something." And we said, "So you want us to hide the microphone from you?" And they said, "Yes." So we want to sort of take that feedback into account, but also make sure that nobody is surprised that they're being recorded in the home. So I'll talk a little bit about that management of that tension later on. So in addition to the physical sensors, we wanted to design the study. And so we came up with a set of 4 scripted activities that we'll ask people to do every morning. These are the timed up and go, the 30-second sit to stand test, 2 physical measures that have a lot of support in the literature and have been really well studied. We also added 2 things from the speech language pathology literature, a rainbow, what we call the rainbow passage or the modified rainbow passage, which is just a standardized passage that the person will read each morning at their own pace. And then an audio diary, which will be unscripted. We call it a scripted activity because they're doing the same thing, but we don't tell them what to say. We just say, "Please talk about what you did yesterday for 2 minutes." And so from these, we're going to use our wearable accelerometer and our microphone to measure several features. That is the completion time, speech rate, acoustic features, semantic features. And then from these features, we can infer things about the person's cognitive health, their psychomotor health, and their motor health. To help people complete these activities, we're providing them with detailed instructions that they can use to complete the task in the home. Compliance is a major concern. We want to make sure that we can, coach them through that. Yeah, we can sort of remotely coach them through doing the activity and that they can do it on their own. In addition to these scripted activities, we're going to just keep the sensors on throughout the day. And that will allow us to, isolate times when people are speaking or standing up or brushing teeth or walking, and to extract a whole host of other features, some of which sort of overlap in their inferences that they're making with the scripted activities, and some of which don't. So that'll allow us to get a sense of, like, if we got rid of the scripted activities, and we just looked at things that you were incidentally doing anyway, could we measure the same information? Could we create a system that's just as useful? Because that would save the user time and make things easier on them. So we've, again, extracted a set of features, or we've identified a set of features that are relatively easy to extract, and talked a little bit about the inferences that we can derive from them. This is not to say that these are the end-all be-all features. We're interested in expanding on this feature set based on the current literature, which is actually evolving quite rapidly. Now, returning to the question of audio privacy. I talked a little bit earlier about this tension between wanting people to know that they're being recorded, not being surprised by that, and making the sensors unobtrusive, so they're not in your face and changing your home environment that you've spent a lot of time getting just the way you like. So our approach to this is basically to make opt-out options as easy as possible. So we've created a pause button that will be centrally placed by the microphone. And if you want to stop recording, you can just press that button. It will mark that period for deletion, and that until you turn it back on, that speech will be disregarded in our analysis. And we'll sort of let them know that if they forget to turn it back on, then it'll, I think, restart overnight and start recording again the next morning. And we also include an exclusion period logbook, so that if the person forgets to press the pause button, or they decide later that they wouldn't like someone to hear what was just said, they can mark on this logbook the start date and start and times that they would like to keep private. And again, this will allow us to go back and delete these parts of the audio before they're analyzed. We also created a posted sign for visitors, so that the user can choose to put this by the door, just to let people know that the home's being recorded, that it's for research, and give them a little bit of information about how the data could be used, so that they could, a visitor could choose to either enter this in the logbook or maybe not enter if they don't want to be recorded. And we've been talking a lot about this tension with unobtrusiveness and what the physical design should look like. So that's something we're nearing completion on, but are still open to the thoughts of this group. And another area that we spend a lot of time is, how can we manage this in-home data collection when our researchers are not on site? So can we get measures of quality assurance that we can use to check on whether the sensors are still working? We plan to store the sensitive data on site, rather than trying to send it through the cloud, where it could be intercepted by bad actors. But what we'd like to do is have the on-site sensors extract anonymous quality measures. So not what is being said, maybe, but maybe how many words are being said, or what the volume recorded by the sensors are. And we'd like to sort of plot these anonymous quality measures using the processing computer, which will be on site. And then we want to be able to access those quality measure plots using a mesh VPN from service Tailscale, which is sort of an industry standard for securely sharing data between and across sites. So this uses end-to-end encryption. It should be quite secure, and even if it was intercepted somehow, we believe that the data couldn't really be used to harm the user. The challenges that we come across is variable internet access. These are we're in Vermont. These are rural areas, and some of them don't have secure, reliable internet access. Some of them don't have Wi-Fi in their homes. And the other things I'm worried about are there are multiple potential failure points here. Each of these sensors has its own transmitter that's collecting the data and then sending it to the processor. and any of those things could fail. And there's limited ability to remotely debug. If we find out that something's not working, we can have a video call with the user. But to anyone who's tried to help their grandmother with their tech, you probably know that how challenging that can be. And if it's anything beyond restarting it, chances are we might have to travel to the site. So this is an interesting challenge that we're up against. Once we've recorded for 6 days on site, we want to talk to the users about how they felt about this system. And so we're planning to give them a survey at the end that asks them for their general impressions of the HealthTRAC system. How easy was it to use? How comfortable were you having the sensors in your home? Did they interfere with your activities? And would you be willing to use this system for a year or more? And finally, we'll ask them about each sensor and each activity separately to get a sense of whether some sensors are maybe more onerous than others and should be reconsidered. So we're going to keep a particular eye on the microphones here as something that people had the most caution about in their surveys, but we'd like to get it for all the sensors. And it really could depend a lot on how things go during the week. So as we develop as we sort of measure this in the homes, we want to also be developing this on-site speech processing pipeline that might be able to extract some of these features in an eventual device on site, rather than making us have to travel to the site, pick up the hard drive, and bring it back to UVM. So eventually, we'd like the processor to just extract our automated metric, on the Raspberry Pi on the premises. This is something that we're planning to use AITC funds to help us to create, but not something that we plan to use in this data collection that we're starting right now. So this system would have to do a lot of things that our StoryCorps archive study did: transcribe and diarize the audio, extract the features, combine the features using our classifier that we've developed, and find some way to report these features to the researchers, to the to clinicians, or to the user and their families. So that is, it could look something like this, where you have a speech-derived risk factor as a function of time. And if you see a rapid change or increase in that risk factor, and if that exceeds some threshold, then you might alert the user to that change. We have, a decent amount. I've talked a lot about the speech-derived risk factors, but we're of course also interested in physical activity and physical health. And so we're taking advantage of work done by my collaborators at UVM and others in the literature for automatically extracting, sit-to-stand transitions from the wearable accelerometer data, and from taking advantage of the sensors that we've placed on the armrests of the user's favorite chair. So there's past work suggesting that these sit-to-stand transitions can be quite informative, sort of balance and fall risk, and as well as other conditions. And so we're interested in identifying those automatically. Going forward, we might try to classify physical activity in more fine-grained levels. There's work doing this in a younger population to measure what a person was doing at any given time. In this population, we would be most interested in just bouts of walking versus bouts of housework, or sitting versus lying down versus standing versus walking. And we're thinking about the eventual design of this system in the home, and ways that we might want this to work and look in an eventual system. Other future work is going to hopefully improve on the diarization and the automatic recognition of roles. That is, who is the user, and who is the caregiver, and who is a visitor. This is something that is an active area of research in our StoryCorps archive, where we're making use of multiple audio channels we are using sort of heuristics on top of the Piano or Piano systems diarization measures. I won't get into the details here, but we do have plans to sort of assign roles to the users in the StoryCorps archive, where we do know who's in the conversation and who's not. And then we'll have to make further updates for the HealthTRAC data, where we perhaps don't know how many people entered the house and who is talking. So we do have multiple microphones, and each microphone is sort of an array of directional microphones that can help us to get spatial positioning. And we're hoping that that can be used to help us get better diarization. We're then interested in looking at these features we've extracted from conversation in our StoryCorps data set and comparing that with sort of more conventional measures that people might get from monologues, which is an area of research that has traditionally been more widely used. So TalkBank and Dementia Bank are examples of collecting data for this purpose. And so we're interested in, how can each of these be used separately? To what extent is the information we get from them redundant? And to what extent is it complementary? And how much do we really need the scripted activities in these monologues? And how much can we just use the conversational features that we've identified? We're also interested in adding to our conversational set of features, using things like silences, and pauses, which have been studied by our collaborators here at UVM in quite good detail. And the prosodic measures, vocal quality, which I highlighted at the beginning and which was mentioned in one of these questions, which we expect to add quite a bit of good information to our classifier, but which we're just at the beginning stages of extracting. The automated measures of extracting these are actually turning out to be a little challenging because they're often designed for being extracted from a monologue, and when you have a dialogue with overlapping speech, this can be it can be quite sensitive to things like back channels and overlap. So all in all, what I've measured here, what I've talked about are establishing these conversational norms, defining a speech-derived risk factor, assessing attitudes about the sensors we might place in the home, designing that sensor system, evaluating how usable it is and how acceptable it might be to users, developing this on-site pipeline that could measure these features in real time, and the ways in which we might improve this and make it a viable device in the future. So this has been a hugely collaborative bit of work that spans multiple groups here at the University of Vermont. We're very excited to be interacting with the AITC on this, because this is a group that really has a lot of experience and know-how in doing exactly this kind of thing. So we're excited to have interactions with the AITC, help us sort of grow our awareness of potential pitfalls, grow the potential population that we might test our system on, and just make sure that we're doing things the right way as we embark on this exciting data collection. So thank you all for your attention. I want to again invite you to email me at djangraw@uvm.edu if you'd like to get in touch about any of this, and I'll spend the last couple of minutes taking questions. So thank you again to our funders for their support, especially the AITC, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for your attention. All right, I have a couple of more questions here in the Q&A. Rob asked, have you thought about the potential of using passive ambient sensors that is based on movement, thinking passive IR, which have the advantage of respecting privacy? Yeah, we have thought a little bit about this. Rather than the wearable accelerometer, could we have something that just sort of measures periods of gait and gets something like a simple feature like walking speed? You might be able to get with a really unobtrusive sensor that might just have IR or video or even something like radar, I think has recently been used. So it's something we've thought about, and our choice here was driven by the idea that we can use this for exploration by collecting, a larger set of features from the accelerometer, the wearable accelerometer. We can see, how much do we need the other things that maybe the really unobtrusive sensors couldn't get. And if we find out that those are redundant and we really just need walking speed, which is absolutely possible, then we might move to an even more unobtrusive sensor in the future. But in the meantime, in this pilot study, we can test that hypothesis and we can get some measure of sort of how much the user dislikes having that thing on their wrist. Okay. Let's see. Gerald asked, will participants be evaluated for hearing loss? I don't think it's something that's currently in our IRB protocol, but it's a great idea. That's certainly going to affect how they speak and how they listen. So I think that's a great suggestion to include that. Let's see. Adam asked, are you interested in integrating loneliness psycholinguistic measures as a means of better understanding both cognition and frailty? Yes, I am. I think our understanding of just how problematic loneliness is and how useful it is as a metric is really expanding lately, and I would love to sort of include that construct in our classifiers, and hopefully the data set we collect here will give us some insight into loneliness, just in how much they're talking to other people as at least a proxy of it. It's a little tricky because we're only measuring in the home, and so if the person is super social outside of their home and they just leave in the morning and have conversations all day and come home and go to sleep, we won't be able to see that. So we'll see how good our in-home proxy is at measuring. Great, and I had someone asked if I can share my email here, and yes, I would be delighted to. I'll type it in right now. And I think with that, I've made it to the end of the Q&A. So I just want to thank everyone again for their attention and their really thoughtful questions and suggestions. And I hope that I'll be able to refer back to some of these questions and suggestions, because I'm sure I didn't remember them all as I was talking, but this has already been really helpful for getting a sense of how we'll move forward. And I'm looking forward to interacting with more of you as we embark on this pilot program and try to expand it. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, David.